Ranka Primorac. I'm a lecturer at the Department of English, University of Southampton, which has made it possible for me to be here at Ake. In 2006, I wrote a book on the Zimbabwean novel, especially the way in which contemporary Zimbabwean novels were influenced by the political changes or expressed political changes that have taken place in Zimbabwe since independence. In Zimbabwe, the problem of space, just purely how the country was divided into compartments by the colonial system, has been a bit of national unfinished business since independence, and that problem came to a head, as we all know very well, in the year 2000 when agricultural land was redistributed by the government. It just so happened that at that time I was working on this book. So the book became a discussion of how space and land and the ideas of how space is used and how people move across space is expressed in literature. In 2010, I edited a book on how literature and culture handle the idea of cities and city life in Africa. That was not just about Zimbabwe, that was about all regions and all the major regions in Africa. So that's an edited book called Africa's City Textualities. I really enjoyed my own panel where I spoke to three young, very important, very good, very up-and-coming Zimbabwean writers. The writers are called Tendai Huchu, Panashe Chigumadzi, and Novala Bulawayo. They all wrote wonderful city books. Their fictions all take place in cities, and we had a wonderful conversation yesterday. I've gone to all the panels that I could manage in the 2 days of Ake. The ones that are particularly memorable, I think Teju Cole yesterday. Who was he with? Teju Cole was on stage with Helen Kabila. Okay, so Teju Cole and Helen Kabila, because it was an opportunity to see African international superstars on stage, and that was quite spectacular. I also really enjoy going to see Wole Soyinka's old school. We went to the Abakuta Grammar School, and I was there with Tendai Huchu and Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I will always remember that, the way school kids reacted to seeing a literary legend and how nice he was with them, how very, very kindly and patiently he spoke to them about writing. In the last 15 years, two things have changed in my opinion. One is the literature is beginning to open itself more to the world. Young writers are not only writing about their country anymore, they are still doing that, but they're also writing about other places and how their country relates to the wider world. This was previously not so regularly the case. There's a writer called Dambudzo Marechera who did do that very early on, but now there are many writers who could be called his descendants. The other thing that's happened is this literature has become funny, it's become humorous, it's become attuned to the ludicrous and ridiculous aspect of the situation in Zimbabwe. It's a stereotype, it's a kind of cliche to say Zimbabweans are resilient. Well, some cliches have some truth in it, and yeah, they are resilient. What the world should also know is that they are very funny, very witty people. They are very cultured people, they are very cosmopolitan people, and all of those things are now coming to the forefront. How much impact does literature have on political culture anywhere? Well, that's a very good question. On the one hand, you could say it has very little, because it's only books. What really can books do to change material realities on the ground? If we are talking about a complicated and violent situation such as Zimbabwe's, it would be very easy to argue that politicians don't read, most of Zimbabweans have no money to buy their own books, and books are marginal, they have a certain amount of relevance that is indirect. That is one way of looking at it. That way of looking at it is incomplete. I would like to argue that literature and culture do have a way of putting pressure on political activities, on political activities in the material world. It's a very well-known fact. Dictators everywhere fear writers. They are very uncomfortable when writers critique them. They are particularly uncomfortable when writers critique them efficiently, when they are witty, when they make their audiences laugh. So Mugabe's regime has been known to put pressure back. The author Chandra Hamer has recently died in exile in Norway, and while he wasn't openly persecuted, he has said before he died that he's had to leave his country because he was beginning to feel uncomfortable. There were certain subtle pressures put on him. He was getting arrested for things like traffic offenses a little bit too kind of conspicuously, so he's had to leave. The government has also been very keen to co-opt writers who are critics. So the government newspaper, the Herald, has been very assiduous in praising sons and daughters of the soil who have made it overseas as writers. Ironically so, because many of those sons and daughters of the soil have been very, very critical of the political realities in Zimbabwe. So people like Tsitsi Dangaramba, Dambudzo Marechera, and others are regularly celebrated in the government media in Zimbabwe. And that testifies to how much the government wants to make sure it neutralizes any critical influence they might have on the reader. So you've got an interesting situation. Young readers in Zimbabwe know about these writers and they want to read them, but the government cannot really go completely out of its ways to stop them because that will be counterproductive. So there are ways, despite the difficulties, there are ways in which literature continues to have a say in national political affairs. One current writer I should mention, she's a writer who is not here, but I'm sure it knows about her and will invite her in the future, is Bettina Gapa. She has 2 books of short stories. Her novel, The Book of Memory, is recently out. She is someone who has got to a point where she can live part of her life in Zimbabwe and spend part of her writing life outside. And she is a very influential cultural figure. She is very active on social media. She speaks regularly to journalists. She speaks generally to public figures. And it would be very fair to say she is making a difference. It's far from a situation where she and her colleagues are irrelevant. And I have enjoyed absolutely every aspect of this festival. It is superbly organized. It has the top names of Africa's cultural activists and literati present here. But what I've enjoyed most is the open-minded and open atmosphere here, where global stars such as Teju Cole can mix freely with local students and aspiring writers, and everyone can have one big conversation together about the future of African letters.